Hello, dear friends of the Chinese Language Division. Welcome to this episode of our podcast. My name is Rony Gao, filling in for Jesse again for this episode. And we are recording live in rainy Portland right after the ATA 65 annual conference has officially ended. Our guest today is an old friend of the CLD community, Aaron Hebenstreit, previously trained as an engineer and now working as a Chinese translator and interpreter. I will let Aaron introduce himself properly.
Hi, everyone. This is Aaron. I think I know many of you, but in case you are not familiar with my background, as Rony said, I did my undergraduate degree in engineering. That was an interesting program. It was an international program, so I was able to study abroad and do internships in Europe. But at the same time, I started learning Chinese. And so after university, I went to learn Chinese more in mainland China and Taiwan. And that gave me the inspiration to consider a path in translation. So that's how I ended up at MIS, the Middlebury Institute of International Studies at Monterey, where I majored in Chinese translation. And then after that, I moved to New York because of an opportunity for an internship with the United Nations. And that's where I was for several years before moving to Texas, where I am now.
Great, Aaron. If you don't mind, give us some more details about the kind of work that you're involved with right now.
I work as a translator and an interpreter, as you said, probably about half and half. Over the years, I think it's averaged out to about half and half equally. I do also take on some teaching work part-time, which is an enjoyable change of pace from the regular work of translation and interpretation. I do enjoy that, and that's part of my extracurricular activities. But yeah, I do a lot of types of translation and interpretation. For translation, I got a lot of experience working at the UN, so that ended up being content related to political, economic, cultural, and other types of subject matter, technical included, legal. And with interpretation, that has been primarily in the private sector, with a couple of jobs with international organizations, but mostly in the private sector. And that has been working with law firms and attorneys on different types of projects, companies, individuals, startups, and accelerators and different types of settings. So that's been really interesting too.
One question we do have to ask, I guess many people would have asked you about this, is why Chinese? What do you think are some of the challenges and advantages for you working as a Chinese English linguist with Chinese as a second language that you only started learning as an adult?
Yeah, that's a good question. Compared to other languages, not a lot of Americans or not enough Americans learn Chinese or other Asian languages. I guess it was really out of my own curiosity. There wasn't any other reason behind it. So I went and audited a Chinese course in college and thought it was interesting. The teacher was inspiring, told me all about Chinese culture and characters, and we practiced sounds and writing and all different aspects of the language. So that really got me hooked, I think. My first trip to Asia, any Asian country, was to China, where I went to attend an intensive summer course to really get better at the language. Of course, at that time, it was still at a basic level for me, but I was able to grow over time, and now it's been almost 20 years that I've been learning it, and I feel like it's still learning new things every day.
Can you give us some perhaps highlights of your career, memorable moments or interesting projects that you worked on?
Sure. Yeah, I've been doing this type of work, translation and interpretation, for about 10 years now. And it's a really interesting field, as I'm sure all of our listeners know, because you get exposure to all different industries. You're not usually limited to one particular area, unless, of course, you're working as a staff linguist, but even then, that will become a specialty for you. So it's not that it's a bad thing, but I also enjoy the experience of being able to just work with different types of clients. You never know what you're going to get. I've worked within the UN system, as I said before, so that has allowed me access to the language of global diplomacy and international relations, specifically relating to China, of course. So being able to look at documents and speeches presented by the delegation of China to the UN has been a really unique experience in my training overall. I've worked on interesting interpretation projects as well, like trials, compliance projects involving travel to different countries and working with teams of attorneys and facilitating communication between the American and Chinese sides on a variety of topics. It's been really eye-opening and educational for me as a linguist. And of course, it's a great job because we get paid to do it, right? So we get paid to keep learning new things all the time. I've also done teaching work, and that's been interesting for me too. That has led to other things such as bilingual MC events, where I've been asked to help out Chinese friends in things like Chinese New Year events or the Mid-Autumn Festival or arts and culture festivals and things to really raise awareness of Asian cultures. So that's been cool to be involved in as well.
Glad to hear that you think it's cool. I was asking about the perks and challenges of being a Chinese speaker without being ethnically Chinese. I guess you see that as a perk.
Yeah, it's very interesting for me because people see me and they don't expect that I'll speak Chinese. So that can be a surprise sometimes. I think it's been useful when working with American clients sometimes because they appreciate that someone who looks like them can speak the language of the
Yeah,
other party that they're interacting with. And I think that's pretty universal. It's not only here in the US. This is any culture appreciates that when someone who grew up in their own environment can speak another language and help communicate between two sides.
absolutely. And even the Chinese clients, I guess they would be typically a little surprised to know
Yeah,
that you speak such fluent Chinese and
yeah.
automatically think that you must have something special. You must be a smart and
Well,
talented person to
well.
be able to master the language, no?
No, that's flattering, but I think that also leads to one of the challenges for me, which is that, of course, because I'm not a native Chinese speaker, it's very hard to produce the same level of Chinese language that someone who was born and raised in China would be able to do. So that's a challenge from my perspective. But on the other hand, it also means that I can present things in English sometimes to enough to make the clients happy.
Yeah, talking about that, I also wanted to take this chance to thank you, Aaron, for always contributing very insightful and interesting content at these annual conferences of the ATA. I
Oh,
think
yeah,
I
those have been
lost
fun.
count of how many of your sessions I've attended at the conference over the years. You always have some really insightful things to say about your approach, being a native English speaker, translating Chinese content. So thank you for that.
Yeah, you're welcome. It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. I think everyone, I would encourage, speaking of that, I would encourage all of our CLD listeners to get involved. And if you do have a topic that you think is interesting and you want to talk about, we would like to see more Chinese presentations at the ATA annual conference. So those are always the most interesting for us, right? Because we're all looking at the same language.
For those of our listeners who are not so familiar with how the annual conference operates, they have a set timeline where I think by March of every year,
Yeah.
they allow you to submit proposals to present. And if your proposal is selected, then you'll get either 30 to 60 minutes of time, depending
Yep.
on the length of it, to talk about something that you do. I've been hearing from those who attend the conference for the first time that the conference is not quite what they were expecting in the sense that it's more practical.
Hmm.
A lot of the presenters, if not most of them, are practitioners
Yeah.
rather than academics.
Right.
Because usually when you go to a industry conference, you would, or conference of a specific field, some people are expecting a bunch of PhDs talking about their academic papers, and that's not typically what you see and what you
Yeah.
hear around the ATA conference.
That is for sure. Yeah. What we hear at the ATA conference, what we hear and see is practitioners, like you said, people who are out in the field doing the actual work. There are academic presentations and very intellectual discussions that happen, but it's also very practical. So like you said, I think that's what some people can take away from it, especially their first time. They realize that this is actually very useful in day-to-day work.
Speaking about your involvement with the ATA and especially the Chinese division, you've been serving as an exam grader in the past number of years, haven't you?
Hmm.
Tell us something about the ATA certification. Why should someone consider taking the exam and becoming certified? And in general, just how the certification program works.
Yeah, the ATA certification exam is a timed exam, and it is a really well-recognized credential in our industry. So it's probably the flagship credential, at least in the United States, because this is the American Translators Association. So probably the most authoritative credential for our industry. And I think it is a valuable thing to have. If you pass the exam, it's a feather in your cap. You get to advertise that and use it to market your services. So I think the value is there, and I've seen it myself. I'm not sure if you, I am sure that you've probably seen it yourself too. Rony, you're also a certified translator, if I'm not mistaken. Anyone who is will probably realize that clients look for that when they are looking through the ATA directory or anywhere else on the internet or wherever they're finding you. So that is something that has been mentioned to me by clients, at least in the past. They say, I was looking for an ATA certified translator. I found you. Let's talk about this project. So I think it's very valuable.
What advice would you give to those who are considering taking the Chinese to English exam? How should they prepare themselves?
Yeah, that's a good question too. And like I said, it's not easy. It's not meant to be easy. It's actually intended for what ATA calls mid-career professionals. So some folks who have at least a few years of experience under their belt. So if you don't pass on the first try, don't feel bad about that. That's not an indicator of any sort of failing on your part. But it can sometimes take a couple of tries, just like any professional exam. And yeah, I think as far as advice for potential candidates, there are a couple of important things you need to look at and get familiar with before trying the exam. One is the Into English grading standards. Now, this is something that is going to be important for taking the exam in any language into English. That document has all of the grammar rules and punctuation rules and style rules that you would want to know about writing in English. And all of the Into English graders will be consulting that during the grading process too. So that's an important one to get familiar with. There are a couple other things, and these are all available on the ATS website. Some of you may have heard of them before, but there are documents that go through how error points are assigned. For example, there can be a minor error will not be worth as much as a major error. So it depends on the impact it has on the surrounding context and how the reader would understand it. And all of that is described in the error classification document that can also be found on the website. Another couple of tips I think I would have for candidates is the first is to read as much as you can in not only your native language, but also the other language. So in our case, Chinese and English, you have to read in both of those languages, read authoritative journalistic writing. And also, the second point is to consider taking the practice test, because that has been found to be a useful tool for people getting ready for the actual certification exam. The practice test is useful because it pulls retired passages that were previously used on the actual certification exam. So there is a real life value to that as well.
Last but not least, let's talk about the annual conference, since we are here in person recording this in Portland, where we attended 3-4 days of conference sessions. Aaron, why don't you first talk about your personal experience with the ATA annual conference in the past years in general, and perhaps share some specific impressions from ATA 65 this year, 2024 in Portland.
Yeah, we should talk about the conference. The first time I attended was in 2017, and that was in Washington, D.C. I think it was also where the first time I met you, right?
That was my first ATA conference.
That was your first too. Okay, so there we go. And that turned out to be very valuable, I would say, and practically useful for me, because at that first conference, I actually was able to meet a client who later provided me with quite a good amount of work over the next couple of years. So that means that my investment in the conference was already returned right from the first time I attended. And that was, of course, really encouraging. And I wanted to attend more. Even if that hadn't happened, though, I would have come to another one after it, because it was just so engaging. We say it all the time, but you find your professional home, and you find your like-minded colleagues and people who understand the nuances of your work day to day and want to talk about it a lot. So that's always really interesting. We are recording from Portland here. The weather is different than it was at the last conference, which was in Miami, where it was nice and warm and sunny most of the time. But the other difference is that I think we have something big to celebrate this year in Portland because we have, I believe, the highest number of CLD attendees in all of our history, at least as far as I know.
That's right, absolutely. The CLD dinner was such a blast. We had so many more people than we were expecting that some of us had to stand there while
Yeah.
watching some of the actions happen.
Watching everyone else eat food.
It is a good time. It is a
Yeah.
good time. What about the conference sessions themselves? I heard
Yeah.
that there were something like 140 sessions scheduled over the course of the past 3 days. Can you name one or two of them that you found interesting or useful?
Sure, yeah. I did attend a lot of sessions over the course of the past few days. I always try to attend at least one during every time period that they're offered because there are always so many interesting ones. And I
Yeah.
often have the problem of too many interesting ones happening at the same time. So you end up jumping between rooms to try to catch a little bit of everything.
Mhm.
But I think the two most interesting for me this year were actually one of them was your session on 5 types of vocabulary asymmetry between Chinese and English. And that was really meaningful because it's something that we deal with every day and we all have to consider these things. It's not about translating word for word, but the meaning and capturing those nuances across the linguistic and cultural barriers, and that also the changes you have to make, because that sometimes those changes are not intuitive, and if you're not careful, you may skip over them, like changing and to or vice
Right.
versa between Chinese and English, because sometimes that is actually necessary. There were a lot of interesting things in your presentation. And the other one I found really interesting was the one today that our colleagues Ben and Eve presented on resources for Chinese to English translations. And this was just incredibly useful for people who are working in that language direction. They were able to bring together resources and ideas from both the US and China and consolidate them and synthesize them into a very helpful format for the attendees of that session. So I think that one was really good too.
Great. Thank you, Aaron, for that shout out. I felt very flattered that you mentioned my session, but we try our best to sort of put together something useful, hopefully to inspire some thoughts and
Yeah.
inspire more
Yeah, we do.
colleagues to share what they know.
That's the idea.
Aaron, it's always a pleasure reconnecting with you and sitting down for a chat like this. To those of our listeners, if you did come to ATA 65, we just wanted to let you know, and I say this for Aaron as well, that we really enjoyed interacting with you in the last 2-3 days. And also, next year's annual conference will be in Boston in October 2025. You may want to mark your calendar now.
Please do. Yeah, we're looking forward to it.
Thank you again, Aaron.
Thank you.